Hi everyone, I'm James Brasuell. I'm the managing editor of Planetizen. Welcome to the Ask the Experts Transportation Hangout. Today we're joined by Joe Averkamp. He's the Senior Director of Technology, Policy, and Technical Strategy at Xerox. We're also joined by Donald Shoup, Professor of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. Also joining us, Robert Puentes, Senior Fellow and Director of the Brookings Institution Infrastructure Initiative, and Susan Zielinski, who's the Managing Director of the SMART Initiative at the University of Michigan. They are here to help us discuss the current state of mobility, how urbanization and other trends are affecting cities, and what cities can do to embrace the challenges and changes coming down the pipeline. Welcome, Joe, Donald, Robert, and Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you all here with us today and are ready for a lively conversation about the challenges and issues that cities and individuals are focusing on in cities. As a reminder, you can also join our conversation by using Twitter and the hashtag #MobilityChat. So let's go ahead and get started. Recent Census Bureau data shows that many American cities are experiencing something of a renaissance. About since the economy began to recover, and even a little bit before, in 2010, more people have migrated to metropolitan areas. In many cases, they're reversing the decades-long trend of migration into the suburbs. The census data shows that the net migration was the largest contributor to population growth in all but 5 of the 50 fastest-growing cities in the country. So that's 45 out of 50. We're going to get started with the questions, and starting with that, trying to figure out what is happening in cities and what the implications are. What are the benefits and challenges of growth in cities, and that's cities of all sizes and densities, and how do those benefits and challenges change relative to those sizes and densities? And Robert, let's start with you, starting about the benefits and challenges of growth.
Well, I think it's important to clearly understand exactly what is going on. You're right. I mean, across the planet, urbanization is clearly the dominant trend. More people are living in cities and urban areas than ever before. We've just reached 50% level, so clearly it's happening globally. Domestically, I think it's more of a mixed bag. I think that the cities and the suburbs are generally growing at the same rate. In some places like metropolitan Houston, for example, the suburbs are growing twice as fast as the city. Other places like Denver, Oklahoma City, Richmond, Virginia, places like this, the city is growing faster. So it's a big country. There's an awful lot going on. But for benefits, I think places that are starting to experience these urbanization challenges are providing better access to jobs and economic opportunity for a greater share of their population. It's a greater use of scarce resources by keeping people together, by having higher densities, you're able to provide better services. And then that relates to the challenges. I think the challenges include providing the infrastructure, providing the housing, providing those kinds of services to serve that large urban population, and then clearly the funding that enables them to do that.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up with you, Robert. You wrote an article for Politico last week, and you were talking about how policy maybe needs to change to enable more of the benefits. Can you talk a little bit about the argument that was included in that article?
That was really the focus there was on the federal transportation program and how that program has its roots in the 1950s. And even though we pass new laws every few years, it really hasn't been updated to reflect these dramatic changes that we see that are going on across the country and across the world, but particularly across the country. The demographic changes, the environmental changes, the economic changes. We've got to have a federal transportation framework that meets the realities of the 21st century. We don't have that right now.
Now, Donald, can you maybe follow up? One of your interests is zoning and parking requirements, and this relates to both of these, the issues of cities growing, how cities grow. Can you talk a little bit about how those questions and those considerations can influence?
Well, yes, I think what most people think about growth in cities, they worry about traffic congestion. If everybody knows that new people will bring in cars into an already congested area, they will oppose growth. They will want to restrict the allowed densities and oppose new buildings. So I think if people came without cars, they would hardly be noticed in cities. That they would be new customers, they would be new people on the sidewalks. So I think that our policies that encourage the growth of car ownership are the real problem. That if we could reverse some of our current policies, such as minimum parking requirements and zoning ordinances that guarantee that people will come with cars, then I think our growth would be much more successful. And I think that the only way we're going to be able to really deal with this growth is through better use of prices for parking and for road use. And that is also beginning to happen. I think that the advantage of using prices to govern roads is that it's almost like physical therapy for people. Whenever you go to a doctor, you don't want to have surgery or drugs. You want to have physical therapy first. I think we should have price therapy for cities. That if they don't work, they can always be reversed. They can be changed. And cities, especially San Francisco and Los Angeles, Houston, and Miami, they're experimenting with pricing the roads that they're parking, and I think the results are almost universally beneficial.
Great. So maybe that segues nicely to you, Joe, and the work that you're doing at Xerox, and some of the things you've noticed about congestion and some of the possibilities for how technology can respond to that. Maybe start by talking about what a really congested city looks like, and then what a city can start to do to counteract that.
Sure. So to Donald's point, I mean, we do manage several large parking systems, and one of the things we've observed is that congestion is largely driven by lack of information about parking. We estimate that about 30% of congestion in downtown areas is people circling to find a spot. So the key is it involves pricing, but it's also assembling the information and providing it to the users with a price associated with it so that they can make informed decisions. So part of the challenge is you don't know where parking is available, and you also don't know how much it's going to cost you. So if we can provide that information to the users and then adjust it so that it follows the path of an economic good, that is, when parking is scarce, it should be priced higher, and when parking is widely available, it should be priced lower. And we follow that strategy with parking. We also follow it with tolling. We run many of the toll lanes in the country, LA Metro in particular, where we have dynamic pricing on the toll lane, and the cost of using the toll lane is higher during rush hour when the use of the lane is dear, and it's much lower, say, at 2 a.m. when there's very few people on the roadside. So we agree with the approach to using price as a method to manage demand, and also it's a good technique for raising money. So.
Yeah, Sue, do you want to add a little bit to that? I know that you have a related technological approach, but maybe there's a few key distinctions that can inform this conversation about managing congestion.
Sure, yeah, no, I love what I'm hearing about the nimbleness of the current transportation transformation. I mean, it used to be that last millennium, transportation is about bricks and mortar, it's about things that don't change fast, it's big infrastructure, and I think what's happened now is we've had this incredible nimbleness, I think, enabled by information technology. So whereas before it used to be that you had a road or you had a bus or you had a bicycle, now you can combine all those things using information technology. You can go seamlessly from the bus, get off the bus, pick up a car share vehicle, get onto, leave the car share, pick up a free bicycle, get onto the train from there, all using information apps, using pricing apps, using fare payment apps, all coming together in a sort of a seamless whole. And now what that means is it's much more affordable, and it's actually much easier to plan. You can actually see what's already there in the city, see what's already connecting, and be able to create door-to-door trip for people, and to be able to make that much more possible, much more easily, sometimes even without good infrastructure, without good policy, even without good land use and sometimes without good leadership. We do this kind of work around the world, and we've seen that the kinds of changes that can happen thanks to information technology, and actually I'd say thanks to the new sort of service culture, the mobility as a service, and perhaps the new kinds of business models that are coming with the new information technologies. It's really quite exciting.
Robert, did you look like maybe you want to jump in on that? Were you wanting to follow up? That looks like no.
No, I agree with that. I think that this the application of digital technologies to our urban landscape is transformational. There's still an awful lot that we don't know. I think it's going to be a really exciting time for us trying to figure out what does this all mean for the e-hail taxi industry. What does it mean for these current services that are there right now? What does it mean for low-income neighborhoods in particular? We know there's an awful lot of places in this country where people can't get taxis. Has this really changed that model? We focus an awful lot on the drivers and on the 1099 type employment jobs that folks have being self-employed. But this might have dramatic impacts for these neighborhoods, providing that kind of access that transportation should be doing. So there's an awful lot that we still don't know yet. And then I think there's an awful lot around freight that we don't know. I mean, the growth of the Amazon type economy is going to result in an awful lot of these small little trucks driving all around these cities and these inner suburban areas. We talk a lot about the passenger side of this. I think there's an awful lot we still need to know when it comes to freight and what the e-economy is going to do for those kinds of services.
And actually, if I could just add, I would say, along with moving people and moving goods, there's moving less. And information technology, again, has allowed us to not move at all. I mean, we can do our work at home, we can shop at home, we can even get an operation at home or remotely, we can do our education at home. So there's a real opportunity to think about actually moving less, as well as transportation is also about moving less, and information technology helps that, along with, of course, good urban planning that brings needs and wants closer to where you are, things closer together, and also things like local production and distribution and urban agriculture that allows us to just not have to move. It's not sort of preventing us from moving, but a combination of wise planning and good alliances among people who run the transportation system, along with information technologies, can really help us not have to move if we don't feel like it.
I think this the question of whether or not this is hurting more than it's helping is really one of the key questions right now. Uber made a lot of news last week in New York. Mayor de Blasio announced speculative policy to cap the number of for-hire drivers in the city of New York, and that was based on some congestion concern in New York. But there was a lot of pushback to say that maybe actually they're not adding any more cars to the road, or maybe they are. So, are there, Uber being maybe one of the more famous examples of a sharing economy company that's influencing? What are the other trends and technological innovations that are potentially changing the way people are getting around in cities? Are there other examples? Joe, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, so I think it's, the ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft and others are interesting in that, to Sue's point, we are traveling less. So with the availability of broadband, each of us probably has a better broadband connection into our home than offices did 10 or 15 years ago. And with the penetration of wireless, you can effectively conduct your job from home. And then if you have the availability of a ride-sharing service where it's reliable, and you know that when you step out your door, within a couple minutes you can have a car, it really is going to impact the level of vehicle ownership in the country. And so for us, we do run transit fare management services as well as transit fleet management. And so that's an area that we have to keep an eye on. And I think especially for smaller cities, cities that can't afford large investments in transit, ride-sharing services like that make a lot of sense. For us, with respect to what technologies can help us manage congestion, is For instance, with computer machine vision, we're able to determine the number of occupants in a car, so we can increase the number of high occupancy vehicles on the road, so that you get greater passenger density going into the city. And that is potentially something you could use in a congestion pricing model that would actually benefit Uber, because they're typically carrying more than a passenger. So there are trends like that from a technology perspective that are going to dovetail with societal and policy initiatives that are going to move us forward.
Yeah. So I'm going to move to my final question, and then we'll start to take some questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you, Donald, this question first. And obviously, a lot of people are excited and concerned about mobility in and around cities, and also, the urbanization that we've already addressed. What are the best things and the most effective things for cities to start to do now in addressing the future of urban mobility?
Well, Sue mentioned that people are staying closer to home, and I think that's happening in LA, largely because of the terrible traffic congestion that LA is almost failing as a region, because it's so business unfriendly because of the difficulty of getting around. And I think that the new technology enables smarter policies like congestion pricing and parking pricing. 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable that you would have different prices for parking on different blocks and at different times of day. But now that happens in San Francisco and LA, and people don't even notice that it's happening. They just like it when they get where they're going. They may pay more or less for parking than they previously did, but they like the idea there's a space waiting for them on the block where they're headed. So I think this smart technology allows smart policies, and then the new smart policies increase the demand for the smart technology. I think we're in a feedback system where the technology is moving so fast that policies that economists and especially transportation economists have been recommending for years are now very feasible. You could imagine that in a few years' time, we will have congestion pricing. The roads will be more free-flowing, and there will be more high-occupancy vehicles. I think if the United States just stopped doing bad things and having bad policies, we have a great future. It isn't like we're in Bangladesh and we have nothing to work with. We have a terrific amount to work with, and I think it is this combination of the smart technology making the smart policies possible will be the catalyst, I think, that will improve cities. I think our cities will be great if the transportation problems were solved with the policies that transportation economists have been recommending for decades.
Robert, do you agree with that? Is it technology, or are there other things that cities can do to break through the logjam and start to create better policies?
This technology is certainly transformational. There's no doubt about it. I think there's a bit of a gold rush mentality that seems to be happening now, and we have to make sure that we're not, just like we did on transport infrastructure for a number of years, it can't just be technology for technology's sake, right? And we were trying to solve certain problems, and technology has a role in doing that. It's not just the deployment of technology in the abstract, it's the deployment of technology to solve certain problems. And given the scale back on the federal level, given that a lot of this is being driven by the private sector, and given that cities and urban areas are the new hubs of innovation in this country, so much of this is coming from the bottom up, and it's these new kinds of partnerships between the public and the private side, not privatization and that kind of stuff, but true partnerships with metropolitan leaders, with philanthropies, with political leaders, where we're starting to see a lot of this happen. It's not happening in the abstract, it's happening on the ground in places all around the country.
So these are all great answers, and you guys, thanks so much for your answers so far. The talk about partnerships maybe segues into a question that we're taking from one of our Hangout participants here. And this is, what do you think will be the business model for the future urban transport? And, I'd add on to that, does that involve public-private partnerships, and what do those types of, and how do those business models fit together? Joe or Sue, do you want to start with this? Sue? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't mind. Yeah, I mean, I think what Robert said is really a good start because really it's public-private innovation. And we've got this huge opportunity in a time when technology outpaces policy. Really what it calls for is a kind of a resilient set of partnerships and sectors. So in policy itself, for example, it's more than just transportation policy. It's more than even land use policy. It's also housing, energy, finance and economic development, innovation, tourism, social services, a whole range of things. And then beyond that, from an industry point of view, the industry cluster for transportation is much beyond automotive. I mean, you've got the IT, the real estate, the tourism, the logistics, and then all of these wonderful, what's called disruptive new services. So with that, I think what we've got is an opportunity to build a new formation of policy around a new set of business models. So what kinds of business models are we going to have? Well, there are going to be many of them. And I think we forget sometimes that we make policy in order to get what we want. So it's not that technology takes over. So in a sense, we'll see which cities and which places are really bringing the best policies forward by how things evolve. And we can see that more dynamically now that we have information technology to support that. One last thing is that, you know, I'm seeing now national governments and regional governments are having transportation as an economic development policy and as an industry development policy. It's in Scotland's national constitution. It's an act of parliament that they advance new mobility industry by investing a lot of funds into both disruptive enterprises and startups and the tier ones to come together to both implement locally and develop for export. So this is a huge, you know, multi-trillion-dollar industry, and there are policies that we can both apply and remove to enable that kind of growth.
Joe, do you want to add anything to this discussion about business models?
Sure. And to take off on what Sue was saying, so I think that there's not any one solution that solves all the problems because we have a variety of transportation modes and many constituents that are moving on them. And I guess we take a lesson from the millennials, where they're really headed, as far as we can tell, is they're about utility. They're always going to assess it less on luxury and more on utility. And so that means that we have to deliver the solution that is most effective. And that's going to take models of public-private partnerships, private innovation. I mean, when you think about Uber, there are people that have been studying private transit for some time as a policy initiative, as a solution. But then Uber starts, and Lyft and others start providing a ride-sharing service that essentially solves the problem. So it's some combination of insightful government policies with public-private partnerships and private innovation, delivering the solution from our perspective.
That you brought up millennials is good because we have another audience question that asked about millennials and how they're distinct from boomers in choosing to move around. Is there baby boomers? That is there more to be said about from anybody in the panel? Is there more to be said about the generational change that's happening and how that's influencing these trends in mobility?
Go ahead, Robbie.
I'll say just that quickly that clearly the trends are happening. I mean, we know for sure that they're not the millennials are not driving as much. Their trends in licensing is much lower, and that the dominant trend in the United States of America is just driving more and more and more every year, which was true for a generation, is no longer true. And change of that magnitude can't be the result of just one thing. I think it's too simplistic to say millennials don't want to drive, they're all moving to the city. Clearly that's part of it, but that's not the only thing. The recession certainly had a lot to do with it. I think some other changes in licensing rules and things that are happening on the state level a lot to do with it. But clearly there's something different about millennial travel choices that we have to recognize. And I think the reality is that it's not that they're eschewing one mode for another, but they're looking for what we always say that folks are always looking for, looking for choices. And they will take the most rational mode to get their task done, whether it's bike sharing or car sharing or driving or transit, whatever it is. If it's cheap, reliable, and predictable, they'll take it as well you should expect it.
And if I can jump in, I'd say cheap, reliable, and connected, because if you can seamlessly connect all of your different modes on demand and you can have what you want when you want, of course that fits the new millennial culture, but it's also really showing to be the same kind of need for seniors and even for the poor, the urban poor. So what you've got is these overlaps. And when you think about it, well, would I want a kind of a transportation system that would provide all my needs in whatever way I wanted, on demand, using information technologies that I could just signal when I wanted to go somewhere and have the supports for that? And so it's really nice. It's not even just the millennial culture that is demanding that kind of a system. It's applying to, I suppose, also underserved populations, not just the millennials.
Great. So I'm going to ask the last question, and it's also an audience question here before we wrap up, and maybe this will give everyone a chance to chime in one last time. The question is, would any of you suggest changes to tax policy that would provide a disincentive to private vehicle ownership? And maybe we can talk about more broadly whether private vehicle ownership is something we really need to be working against so specifically. And then if so, is tax policy the place to start with that? Donald, would you like to start off this? What would you suggest tax policy to provide a disincentive to private vehicle ownership?
Well, I would expand that to pricing policy. I think we ought to recognize that our surface transportation system in the United States is messed up big time. That we tried to manage a huge sector of the economy without using prices. Can you imagine the food supply being managed without prices, or the housing supply, or anything else? Somehow we think that we can have free roads and free parking and everything is going to be great. And it isn't only taxes that are important. I think that prices are important. I think that the gas tax, of course, hasn't been changed for 2 decades, but we are getting more managed lanes on the roads. I think that it should be a combination of taxes and prices. And if we have new taxes, I think they ought to be based on use, and rather than on simply the ownership of a vehicle. Certainly the gas tax would be a great change to make.
Joe, do you have something to add to that?
Sure. So I am inclined to agree with Don in that. So I don't know that we want tax disincentives, but we prefer to focus on user fees, whether they be tolls or there's also road use charging strategies being deployed. Oregon is using a vehicle miles traveled tax to try to tax the usage of the road. So that, I think, is the proper way to create incentives for users. I don't know about a tax on when you purchase a vehicle is the appropriate approach, because I think there are disincentives to vehicle ownership as it is. I mean, it's an asset that sits in your driveway a lot of the time unused. So people are being very rational in their decision-making process, but I think that if we apply user fees as opposed to taxes, that's a more appropriate approach.
User fees are incredibly unpopular. Tolls are. I mean, Texas is a good place to look to see a pretty controversial number of toll roads under consideration. But Robert, do you want to talk about what you think about this? Do you agree with Donald and Joe, or are there other things maybe people should consider as a disincentive for private vehicle ownership?
Sure, I do agree with what's been said already. I think probably be intentionally provocative, probably the most major thing we could do is to reform the home mortgage income tax deduction. The federal government gave about $70 billion in federal tax breaks through through home mortgage ownership last year. If you really want to do something about that, you'd reform that so we're not subsidizing larger, more expensive homes generally located far out on the suburban fringe.
That is very provocative. Thanks for that, Robert. The largest housing subsidy that the federal government offers, right? The mortgage rate. So, Susan, do you want to chime in for our last comment here on this?
Sure. Yeah, I was on a wavelength with everybody before me, and moving on the incentive side rather than the disincentives, which is location-efficient mortgages were on my list, and I'd say vehicle miles traveled. That's actually an incentive towards using different kinds of modes, and there are all sorts of innovative financing mechanisms, and there are even tax breaks now for parking. You get, employers provide parking to employees, but they don't provide transit. So if we could kind of flip that from a tax and financial incentives point of view, I think we could combine that with a whole range of different things and actually make folks that are using new mobility, sustainable transportation, feel really good about it from a fiscal and a social point of view.
Great. Well, Joe, Donald, Robert, and Susan, thanks for a really great discussion. Obviously, we appreciate your insight and your expertise on these issues, and you've really done a great job of capturing a big picture here and a lot of detail in there. So, and thanks to everyone else out there on the Hangout for joining us. For more information about Xerox Transportation Solutions, visit www.services.xerox.com and search Transportation Solutions. Thank you. I'm James Brasuell. Again, I'm from Planetizen, and this is the Xerox Asks the Experts Transportation Hangout. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.